you vote one DLP and two Liberal Party. So you start to come out of the habit, the lifelong habit of voting for the Labor Party.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. For much of the 20th century, the dividing lines of Australian politics were not just class, economics, or a philosophical preference for collectivism versus individualism, but religion. The Iron Law, which allowed only a few exceptions, was that if you're a Catholic who wished to succeed in politics, you had to join the Labor Party, because Catholics need not apply when pre-selections opened for the coalition. While Menzies himself did not possess these prejudices, a majority of his peers, colleagues, and even his parents evidently did. Hence, he was given an early political lesson when he was personally scolded by his father for appearing on a platform with Catholic Archbishop Mannix during the opening of a Catholic school in his electorate in 1928. But while Menzies may have witnessed bigotry, he would also witness and take a leading role in its gradual demise. From backing Catholic Joseph Lyons to form the United Australia Party in the 1930s, to enjoying the preferences provided by the Labor split in the 1950s, to his simultaneously principled and electorally rewarding embrace of state aid in the 1960s, Menzies was there for all the key steps in the process. In retirement, he's even alleged to have returned the favour by voting DLP. To unpack the history of the Catholic-Labor alliance, this Iron Law, and how it shaped Australian politics for decades, and what its demise reveals about the evolution of our national life, I'm joined by Dr. Jeff Kildea, a retired barrister, honorary professor in Irish Studies at the University of New South Wales, and an author of a new book, Iron Law No More, The Rise and Demise of the Catholic-Labor Alliance in Australia. Welcome once again, Jeff, to Afternoon Light.
Thank you very much, Georgina, for having me on.
Oh, it's great to have you on for a second time. Now, I am fascinated by this Iron Law. There is an impression, I guess, pre-sort of Hawke Keating era, that the Catholic community was Labor-leaning, despite Menzies' best efforts. But how did this come about, this I guess, leaning towards the Labor Party and Labor politics amongst the Catholic community in Australia and the colonies?
Yeah, well, the Catholic-Labor alliance really dates back to the early years of the Commonwealth, and even before that in some of the colonies where Labor was starting to emerge. It really comes into its own once the fiscal issue, that's the question of protection versus free trade, is replaced by capital versus labour, so that the dividing line of Australian politics becomes whether you support the Labor Party or what emerges as then the Liberal Party. And that was basically the divide. But because Catholics were mostly from the working class, Labor, with its advocacy of workers' rights, suited Catholic economic interests, or the economic interests of individual Catholics. But there are other factors that play also. Labor and sort of Catholic philosophy were both communitarian-minded. Protestants and Liberals tended to be more individualistic. It was seen as a Protestant virtue that one is not subject to authority from above. Another factor was Catholics were mostly of Irish heritage, and Labor supported Irish self-government, whereas non-Labor tended to oppose Irish home rule and to support the British Empire. But perhaps the biggest impediment to Catholics joining the Liberal Party was that they were basically unwelcome because of their race, their religion, and their class. So that in the first half of the 20th century, sectarianism was very strong. So there was a strong strand in the non-Labor parties of anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment.
And does that come from Britain, do you think, those anti-Irish sentiments? You know, people are coming from Ireland, obviously, but also from England, Scotland, Wales, and they're importing these sectarian views?
Yeah, very, very much so. Australia inherited the sectarianism which had existed in the United Kingdom, where you have England and Scotland as being Protestant and Ireland largely as being Catholic, except in the northern counties where you have Protestants. That had been going on since Henry VIII. In terms of the Irish versus the British, it had been going on for hundreds of years before that. So it was something that was imported into Australia and took hold. And when through the 19th century Ireland is pressing for self-government, there are many in Australia who supported that, and they were mostly of Irish extraction. But there were many who saw that as the first chink in the armour of the British Empire, that if Ireland were to get self-government, then the British Empire would begin to divide. And so it was very much something that was imported from the UK and became very strong in Australia, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
When you talked a bit before about this sort of communitarian attitudes of Catholics, the Catholic Church and the Pope releases a encyclical, isn't it, every so often, and it states the views of the church on certain issues. And they used to have quite strong views on economic issues. And so is that where these sort of communitarian sentiments are coming from? The teachings of the Pope and the church are that we view the economy in the way it should be carved up, and property rights should be handled in this way. And this is obviously in quite sharp distinction to the, I guess, the idea of private property rights, of free trade, of strong markets, of capitalism.
I think that's the manifestation of it, but I think it goes even deeper. That in Protestant thought, there should be no mediation between God and the individual. And one of the Reformation concerns was that the Catholic Church had interposed itself between God and the individual. And so you have this sense of the individual must determine what's right and wrong and should not be bound by some other authority, which may be dictating what they should think and do. So that then, when you come into the political sphere, you have the Labor Party has this idea of caucus rule and conference rule, so that the policies of the party are set by the conference or the caucus, and the individual members of the party have to accept that, the majority decision. Now, to many Protestants, this was just anathema, because they should not be bound by what this authority of caucus is imposing on them. And so when the fusion comes about in 1909 between the fiscal parties, you'll get even progressive members, say, of the Protectionist Party, who supported Labor on all sorts of practical issues, found that they could not join the Labor Party and they would prefer to join the new Liberal Party, principally because of that difference between how their consciences were to be formed within the party. They could not come at the idea that the caucus could tell them how they must vote in Parliament. And another strand of it, as you mentioned, is in terms of encyclicals, the great encyclical of 1891, Rerum Novarum, when Pope Leo XIII spoke about workers' rights. And that is very much a basis of Catholic social teaching that extends into the 20th and 21st centuries, so that there's idea that workers' rights are of great importance. But on the other hand, one must also remember that encyclical was opposed to socialism, and that Catholic social teaching supports the right of private property, and that socialism, in the sense of all property is owned by the state, that was against Catholic social teaching in Rerum Novarum as well. So to that extent, there is some mutual agreement between Catholics and Protestants. But otherwise, it's this worldview of the individual and should the individual be subject to caucus rule when they're making decisions as to how to vote in Parliament.
It's Interesting, though, this tension between the Labor Party as it develops in Australia, which, has socialism as part of its manifesto, and the support of the Catholic community for the Labor Party, and also the growing numbers of Catholic MPs and even Catholic prime ministers, Catholic leaders in the Labor Party, and how they balance that tension when the church they were a part of was, of course, against the socialist objective.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting theme that emerges very early in the history of the Labor Party in the 1890s and ultimately becomes the source of the split in the 1950s. But if we start back in the 1890s, as the Labor Party is forming, you've got two competing groups. There's the socialists who are wanting to adopt Marxian socialism as the political philosophy of the party. And you have the moderates who are more labourist in the sense that the party is there to improve the practical benefits for the working class. So they see the issue as more pragmatic than the socialists who are more ideologically driven. Now, the Catholic Church, as I said, in Rerum Novarum, condemns socialism. And during the 1890s, Cardinal Moran, the head of the Catholic Church in Sydney, he very much sort of tries to steer Catholics and their involvement in the Labor Party towards the moderate view and would speak out against the Labor Party if it were to tend towards the socialist view. Now, this becomes very important in 1905 because George Reid, the leader of the Free Trade Party, which becomes the anti-socialist party and then later joins with the protectionists to become the Liberal Party, George Reid sees an opportunity to detach Catholics from the Labor Party by emphasising the socialist issue. And for a while he gets some traction, but then Cardinal Moran and the whole of the Catholic bishops in Australia make a statement to the effect that the socialism that the Labor Party supports is not the same as the socialism in Europe that the Church condemns. It's not this ideological Marxist socialism. It's more a labourist socialism that is designed to improve the lot of the working class. And so this intervention by Cardinal Moran enables Catholics in good conscience to support the Labor Party, and ultimately Reid's anti-socialist fear campaign against Catholics in the Labor Party falls apart.
Jeff, do you think that was clever politics on the part of Archbishop Moran, or was that an accurate characterisation of what the Australian Labor Party's socialist objective actually was, as distinct to the, I guess, Bolshevik or, Leninist version?
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit of both. Moran was a very clever politician. He very much attuned to it. And people like William Holman, who becomes Premier of New South Wales, he would often consult with Moran on political issues because Moran had this capacity for understanding politics and how one deals with it. But on the other hand, the fact is that the socialism of the Labor Party has always been more labourist than ideologically Marxist. Certainly there are, within the Labor Party on the left, there'd be people who would be more ideologically Marxist. But generally speaking, Labor has always tended to be this more moderate approach. And that is what Moran saw. And he didn't want Catholics to be deprived of having a means of engaging in politics. I mean, if the non-Labor parties didn't want Catholics, so if Catholics were not able to join the Labor Party because of this issue, then Catholics had nowhere to go politically. I mean, they could form their own party, but that was never going to work, and it was shown in the 1920s when there was a Catholic Party in the early 1920s. It just doesn't go anywhere because Catholics are spread across the community and they can't gather enough forces in single electorates to get into Parliament. So he took a very pragmatic view of keeping Catholics in the Labor Party and ensuring that the Labor Party he would sort of have a bit of a carrot and a stick. He'd ensure that the Labor Party maintained this moderate course rather than an ideologically socialist course.
You talked about George Reed's attempt to lure the Catholic community under the guise of him running an anti-socialist party. But what about Alfred Deakin, who led the Protectionists? Now, he supported a lot of Labor policies on workers' rights in the very early 20th century. Did he not see the potential to appeal to the Catholic vote that would have been, very amenable to anyone who was seen to be standing up for workers' rights?
As I said before, there were many, particularly in the Protectionist Party, of which Deakin was the leader, who, issue by issue, you could say that they did support Labor, and at various times the Protectionists ruled with Labor support and Labor ruled with Protectionist support. But as I say, once the issue became there's only two parties after the fusion, do you support or belong to the party even if you're in tune with some of its issues? That will demand caucus determines how you vote in the parliament. And people like Deakin and others just were not prepared to subject themselves to that dictation by the majority of caucus.
No, they wanted to freely decide for themselves. How strong an influence, Jeff, were the Catholic archbishops on their congregations? I mean, were they really definitive? Archbishop Moran or Mannix later on, when they said this is the political leader, I think matches the objectives of Rerum Novarum, for example, people would follow. I mean, were they quite obedient, is what I'm trying to say?
No, well, one of the questions I pose in the book is whether the bishops led the people or the people led the bishops on some of these issues. And I look at the emergence of the Catholic Labor Alliance in each of the colonies that ultimately become states, and it's quite different. I mean, Moran is very much sort of labourist in his thinking, but some of the bishops in the various colonies were not so supportive of an emerging Labor Party, and they expressed the view that socialism was such that Catholics couldn't support it. There was another strand who were more transactional, and they were saying that, well, we don't think that the Labor Party will support state aid for Catholic schools, so we don't encourage our people to join the Labor Party until it comes out and says it will support state aid. So you get some who are ideologically opposed to Labor, some who are transactionally opposed to Labor. But ultimately, the Catholic people determined that they will support the Labor Party because the Labor Party is more in tune with their economic interests, social interests. And so ultimately, the bishops, in a sense, as I say, they fall in line with the Catholic people thinking, and rather than the other way around.
Do you think, though, that the Catholic Labor Alliance really succeeded in delivering on explicitly Catholic objectives? I mean, as you say, there was opposition to state aid. So actually it was Menzies finally who delivers that as a Liberal Prime Minister, not the Labor Party. Were there things so that the Catholic community could say, well, we've been loyal to the Labor Party. We've got, James Scullin was the first Catholic Prime Minister. We've seen Catholic aspirations and objectives put into policy, and therefore our political loyalty has been rewarded.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to the initial question is no. The Labor Party did not deliver on Catholic specific interests, and in a sense, nor should it. The Labor Party is a party to govern for the whole of Australia. It's not a confessional party that is for the benefit of Catholics. And James Scullin, who you mentioned, he took the view that Catholics, who are mostly working class, would be better off with a Labor government bringing in reforms to assist the workers generally, even if that Labor Party did not deliver on state aid. And so he took the view, let's keep electing Labor governments and improve the lots of the workers, and you'll be better off than if we go out and try to promote state aid, because 75% of the population, the Protestant population, were opposed to state aid. So Labor would not be elected if the party took a pro-state aid position. Now, the wisdom of Scullin's view in that regard is shown in the 1950s when the party splits over the question of communism and communist influence in the Labor Party. And you get the Victorian bishops supporting those Catholic MPs who decided to leave the Labor Party or be expelled from the Labor Party because of their very strict anti-communist approach and their belief that the Labor Party was under undue communist influence. So the Victorian Catholic bishops support that view, but the New South Wales Catholic bishops take the opposite view and say, no, stay in, fight the communists in the Labor Party if that's what you want to do, but stay in the Labor Party. Now, the fruit of that was that Labor was defeated in Victoria and remained out of power for 27 years. In New South Wales, Labor continued to govern until 1965. So, the Scullin idea that it's better to have Labor governments delivering for the workers proved to be quite prophetic for what happened in the 1950s.
The other Labor split, of course, was over conscription. What do you think the impact of that was on the character of the makeup of the Labor Party? Did it become more Catholic when it split over conscription?
Well, it's often claimed that the 1916 Labor split over conscription was decisive in making the party more Catholic.
Because 21 Protestant parliamentarians left the party compared to only 4 Catholics, didn't they? So this,
But as my research shows, and I set out the statistics in the book, even though the split saw more Protestants than Catholics leave the Labor Party, it didn't make a significant difference in terms of Catholic representation in the Labor caucus. The proportion of Catholics in the parliamentary party before the split was 23%. After the split, it's 26%.
Right.
So there's not much of a change. And I include in the book a graph that shows a trend line for Catholic representation in the Labor caucus stretching back to 1901, which continues steadily upwards with some perturbations in the 1930s and 40s until its peak in 1954. But there's no sudden jump in 1916. It's just on the trend line. And so what I say in the book is that after the split, there comes a strong correlation between Catholics and Labor over other issues. For instance, between 1917 and 1931, there's 100 new MPs who enter Parliament on the non-Labor side. 100 new MPs enter Parliament on the non-Labor side. Of those, only one was a Catholic.
Wow, okay.
And he replaced his deceased father at a by-election.
All right, who presumably was also a Catholic, so it was one for one out, one in. Right.
Yeah. But by contrast, in that same period, 55 new Labor MPs were elected to Parliament, of whom 29 were Catholics.
Right, yeah, interesting.
So that's where the big change occurs. So in my opinion, rather than the split, it was the sectarian bitterness of the war years following the Easter Rising in Dublin, the conscription referendums, the anti-war rhetoric of Archbishop Mannix, the Irish War of Independence. And that confirms non-Labor's suspicion of and antagonism towards Australia's Irish Catholic community. They're not loyal. They're not to be trusted. And that provides fertile ground in which the iron law of Australian politics takes root.
I mean, there were many Protestants in the teens blamed Australia's Catholics of Irish descent for the defeat of those 2 conscription referenda. And some were also of the view that the Catholics in Australia actually wanted Germany to win the war so that Ireland might gain its independence. So to have parts of the community believing that the Catholics were wanting the enemy, Germany, to win during World War I must have created some pretty tense environments between the Protestants and the Catholics, I can imagine.
Indeed. And, it's a very nasty, bitter period for Australia in those war years. In 1914, when the war breaks out, Catholics and Protestants both support Britain in the war, and you get Catholics and Protestants both turning up at the recruiting offices and joining up. And a lot of the anti-Catholic rhetoric that had been going around before then subsides. We're all in this together. But then you come to 1916, you get the Easter Rising, you get the referendums, and so sort of truce in the sectarian war breaks down, and things get worse in 1917, 1918, so that we come out of the war very much a divided nation, both on sectarian grounds but also on capital versus labour grounds, because we had the general strike in August of 1917. You're starting to get the Communist Party forming. It's a very turbulent time and a very divided nation that comes out of it. And one of the big factors, one I tend to write about, concentrate on, is the sectarian issue that does come about. And so that does then feed into how Catholics and Labor and Protestants and non-Labor sort of become quite entrenched differences.
What about the defection of Joseph Lyons in the early 1930s and the impact that had, bringing a Catholic, of course, to the non-Labor side, the creation of the United Australia Party, then, of course, the defeat of the Catholic Labor Prime Minister James Scullin? This must have had quite an impact on that impression that Catholics were Labor supporters when you had someone so high profile as Joe Lyons creating a non-Labor political party with people like Robert Menzies.
I mean, Joseph Lyons' emergence as leader of the non-Labor Party in some ways is paradoxical. I've just said that come the 1920s, you've got this very clear distinction between which party Catholics or Protestants will join. So Joseph Lyons sort of stands out, but he doesn't really make much of a difference. The trend line that I spoke about just continues pretty much upwards. There is a little bit of a downward trend after that in 1931 when that split occurs, but that's largely because Labor split also on the left, and you had the Beazley group who were supporting Jack Lang's economic policies, who also left, and most of those were Catholics. So that accounts for why the trend line sort of comes down a bit, but then it regains its trajectory. I think in the Lyons case, it was a unique situation. You had the country divided over economic policy. You had the Labor Party in turmoil over economic policy. Lyons comes through as a person with orthodox views on how to manage the economy. And the leader of the Nationalist Party at the time, John Latham, is sort of seen as a not very impressive political leader, whereas Lyons, and particularly Lyons and his wife Enid, I mean, they're seen as a dynamic duo. They go around the country and people support them, Labor and non-Labor people, because they're making a lot of sense in this economic difficult times. And so Lyons is able to become the leader of the non-Labor forces. I mean, he's a minister in the Labor government who then resigns and then leads this coalition of people who are trying to get the economy of the country back on track. And he is seen to be the one who's got the ideas, but also has got the charisma that will help non-Labor, which forms the United Australia Party, to attract voters from the Labor Party, because Lyons, being a former Labor member, has a following in the Labor Party. So I think it's a case of politics trumping prejudice in the case of Joseph Lyons and his leadership of the UAP, which he does until his death in 1939. Was
there much made of him being a Catholic at the time in the 1930s? I mean, was much made of it in terms of, you're normally Labor, you're Catholic, come and vote for us. We've got a Catholic now leading the non-Labor side, the United Australia Party, or maybe there was anti-Catholic sentiments that said, well, we don't like this, Catholic-led United Australia Party because we're Protestants and that's not for us.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I think politics trumped any prejudice that there may have been, and no doubt there was. But the other thing is that Lyons delivered. They win the 1931 election and then they win the 1934 election. And at that stage, the economy is starting to turn around. Unemployment's coming down. And so he's delivering. And those who maybe anti-Catholics in the UAP are saying that, why get rid of this winning leader when, even though we may not necessarily agree with him, he has shown that he is to be trusted. He's not like those terrible Irish Catholics that we don't trust because they're anti-British and so forth. I mean, he is reliable, he's a winner, and so he's able to then continue to lead the UAP. I mean, things start to fall apart towards the end of his life there, but that's just the normal cut and thrust of politics, I think, rather than people deciding that they don't want a Catholic anymore to lead the UAP. So I think that's the explanation for why Joseph Lyons, the Catholic Labor man, comes to lead the UAP throughout the 1930s.
You don't see the defection of Joseph Lyons to the newly created UAP as the sort of first blow to that, iron law of Catholic Labor Alliance, or is it just an aberration?
No, I think it's a one-off. It's an aberration. In fact, I don't think the first blow is struck until 1947.
Yeah.
And that's over bank nationalisation legislation that Labor Prime Minister Ben Chifley introduces.
And how does the Catholic community react to bank nationalisation? It's been a desire of Ben Chifley for many years before that. He is very committed to the socialist objective, despite the fact, of course, that we know Archbishop Moran saying, well, it's a Labourist socialist objective, so it's an okay one, not the one we don't like, it's an okay one, it's acceptable. But bank nationalisation is a very socialist policy. It's making sure that private capital doesn't own the sort of means of money, the levers of the economy. So it was a winning campaign, of course, in the end for the newly formed Liberal Party who won, really campaigning very hard on bank nationalisation. And some argue that the Liberal Party was sort of made on the basis of that campaign.
I'm not so sure about that. I think opinion polls tend to differ as to whether bank nationalisation was much of an issue in 1949. I think things like the coal strikes and petrol rationing were perhaps more significant issues. I think by 1949, the bank nationalisation issue had dissipated because the legislation was ultimately tossed out by the High Court anyway, and all the political capital that Chifley put into it basically was wasted. But just getting back to the question of the Catholic reaction to it, as I said, 1905, you get the socialist issue is raised and Moran comes in and says, that's okay, fellas. You get it again in 1921 when the Labor Party adopts the socialist objective. And what's interesting there, reading through Catholic newspapers of the time, there's only one small reference to it in 1921 that I can find in a Catholic newspaper, so that it's not seen as a big issue. Mm. But in 1905 and 1921, it's fairly sort of theoretical as an issue. You come to 1947, and you've got to look at what was happening in 1947. The war had just ended. We were in alliance with the Soviet Union, but after the war, the Soviet Union starts to take over Eastern Europe. Catholic countries in Eastern Europe become subject to communist control. In Asia, you have the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and the civil war going on there that ultimately the communists win. You have communist subversion in various countries, such as the Malayan insurgency and so forth. So there is this atmosphere that communism is on the march. And for Catholics, it becomes particularly important because in the 1930s, during the Spanish Civil War, there were many reports in Australian newspapers, and particularly in Catholic newspapers, of the atrocities that were committed against Catholic bishops, priests, nuns, the stories of murders, rapes, burning of convents and churches and so forth. So for Catholics, it's no longer a theoretical issue, it's an existential issue. We have the Communist Party gaining control in the trade unions, and there are Catholics out there in the Catholic social studies movement fighting that in the trade union elections and trade union meetings. So there's this sort of sense of a struggle with communism, and it's not a theoretical issue at all. It's an existential issue. And so 1947, when Chifley comes up with the bank nationalisation, it then comes under the microscope. Now, the funny thing about it is that it was all a bit of a knee-jerk reaction because Chifley was trying to get a central bank system going where the national government apparatus would manage the whole of the economy for Australia. And that was seen generally as not a bad idea. But the trouble was that, again, the High Court came in and upset some of his legislation, and not even the most critical part, but some of it. But Chifley took the view that this was the thin end of the wedge and that he needed to do something to shore up this national control over the economy. And so within a few days of the High Court decision, they come up with this policy of bank nationalisation. Now, sure, Chifley had supported bank nationalisation in the Royal Commission on Banking in the 1930s. It was part of the socialist objective, I guess. So in one sense, it shouldn't be a surprise, but in another sense, it was a surprise. It was just a knee-jerk reaction to this High Court decision. And what you get is some Catholics then, particularly Catholics in New South Wales, coming out and saying, well, this is socialism. This is socialism that Catholics cannot support. Ironically, it's the Victorian Catholics who take a much more pragmatic view. Archbishop Mannix and B.A. Santa Maria take the view that this is not the socialism that Catholics should oppose. Now, whether or not it's the best way to achieve the aim is another question, but that's a political question, that's a prudential question. But Santa Maria and Mannix say there's no Catholic issue here. On the other hand, Archbishop Dewey in Brisbane says this is communism, this is terrible. So, but what it does, it starts to insert the wedge into the Catholic community and the Labor Party.
And this sense that the communists are infiltrating trade unions and infiltrating the labour movement, and therefore starts the seeds of, that become the labour split. Of the 50s.
It's the context in which all of this happens and is the first chink that emerges in the armour of the Catholic Labor Alliance. Now, it doesn't continue. And as I say, by the 1949 election, it's not such a big issue. But it does come up again after that, the issue of socialism.
How does the Labor split of the 50s impact this Iron Law and the attachment between the Catholic community and Labor? Is that where you see, you say it really starts to break apart in 47 with bank nationalisation, but is it that Labor split of the 50s that you really see things crumbling?
Yes. And so this sort of atmosphere of the communist threat continues to be there in the 1950s. And one of the products of the 1949 election was that there were a number of very firm anti-communist Catholics who were elected to the Labor Party from Victoria. And they have this very strong view that Labor has to be purged of any communist influence. And so they're elected in 1949 and they start to pick away. You've got the Catholic Social Studies movement, still fighting the good fight in the trade unions, but that's basically been won by then. And some in the Labor Party fear that, in fact, the Catholics are now not sort of fighting this good fight against the communists, but starting to turn their sights on dominating Labor policy and taking over the Labor Party. So you get many in the Labor Party fearing what these strong anti-communist Catholics are up to. And you come to 1954, you've got the Petrov affair comes out where the Russian diplomat defects and says that there's been infiltration of the Australian government by Soviet forces and so forth. So you get, in 1954, again, this whole issue of communism becomes important and Labor loses the 1954 elections very narrowly. And so Evatt comes under pressure, having lost the unlosable election. And he sort of says it was all, a plot that Menzies used the Petrov affair to defeat him and to defeat Labor. And so he becomes quite erratic over it all through 1954. And then you get to 1955, the Victorian Catholic sort of Labor executive sends its delegates to the annual conference, and there's a bust up there because the federal executive has already intervened in Victoria and has dismissed the executive, and you've got this terrible internal war going on in 1955. So you've got this sort of these Catholic anti-communists, strong anti-communists, and you've got this backlash coming from other Labor people who include Catholics as well, who fear that these anti-communists are becoming too powerful, and that sort of splits the party. Now, what happens, of course, is that many Catholics leave the Labor Party. Many Catholics are expelled from the Labor Party because they are supporters of this strong anti-communist streak, and particularly in Victoria. And so it becomes a big wedge into the Catholic Labor alliance.
Do you see Doc Evatt, the federal Labor leader at the time, as having particular sectarian, anti-Catholic views, or was he obviously has an erratic decline, and I think he's largely viewed as someone who was brilliant, but in the later part of his career becomes quite flawed and unstable. But, I mean, were his views on the split and his handling on the split, do you think they were informed by some anti-Catholic sentiment?
No, I don't think so. I haven't seen any evidence that Evatt was particularly anti-Catholic. I think what leads to his bust-up with the sort of the Catholic right of the Labor Party is more in terms of Labor's internal politics, and in particular his leadership, because having lost the 54 election and having sort of gone off on this mad anti-Petrov business, he becomes under pressure, and you've got, as I say, many in the Labor Party fearing the Catholic takeover. So I think it's more a political thing that when in October 1954 he denounces this great conspiracy of the Catholics taking over the Labor Party. I think that's more a political strategy to shore up his leadership rather than because he's anti-Catholic.
It takes a long time, despite the split and, of course, the creation of the DLP, the Democratic Labor Party, which is really an anti-communist Catholic version of the Labor Party, spearheaded by a sort of spiritual leader, B.A. Santa Maria, who becomes really, in the end, a lifelong friend of Bob Menzies. But it takes a long time for the Catholic vote to shift to the coalition, to the Liberal Party, despite the Liberal Party being the party that is avowedly anti-communist, and despite Menzies in 1963 deciding to fund Catholic schools, non-government schools, through the introduction of state aid funding. So why is it that it takes so long for the votes to flow?
Well, we first get with the formation of the Democratic Labor Party in 1957. I mean, it starts out as the Australian Labor Party anti-communist, and then changed its name to the Democratic Labor Party. And because it's very strongly anti-communist, it attracts many Catholics. And its raison d'etre becomes, we will go back to supporting a Labor Party and a Labor government if the party purges itself of this evil communist influence that is affecting it. And, of course, in their view. So Catholics who are of that view will vote for the Democratic Labor Party. And as part of the DLP's strategy for ensuring the Labor Party purges itself, it says we'll direct our preferences to the Liberal Party rather than to the Labor Party. And that works effectively. And if you look at the results of various elections over the period, the DLP preference strategy basically keeps Labor out of power until 1972. And so you've got Catholics who are voting for the DLP, number one, because that's their party, and most of the DLP support comes from Catholics. Many Protestants also support it, but largely it's supported by Catholics. Largely it's comprised of Catholics. And you vote one DLP and two Liberal Party. So you start to come out of the lifelong habit of voting for the Labor Party. Now, when the DLP eventually collapses in the mid-1970s, so it's around for about 20 years, 1974 loses all its senators, and so it ceases to be a power. you've got then DLP voters say, well, who do I vote for now? It's my number one preference, because the DLP is no longer there to vote for as my number one preference. And you've got the old-time Labor supporters who go back to Labor. But there's this large group of conservative Catholics who see Labor as becoming too progressive on social issues, and they find it more of a home with the Liberal Party. And having broken the habit of a lifetime in voting Labor, it's much easier now to vote for the Liberal Party once the DLP is gone. And the other factor, of course, is that there's this rise of the socio-economic status of Catholics. So in terms of their economic interests, whereas at the start of the 20th century it was towards the Labor Party, many of them now, their economic interests are more aligned with that of the Liberal Party. But it does take a while, and it's not until 1996 that for the first time you get a majority of Catholics voting for the coalition parties as opposed to the Labor Party. So it's sort of this a gradual process, but you get to then and thereafter. And for most of the elections of the 21st century, Catholics have supported the coalition parties.
But it took till 2007 for the Liberal Party to be led, I think this is right, by a Catholic again. Well, not that it was ever led. I mean, Joe Lyons, of course, led the UAP, but that's quite a while to wait. And then since then, there's actually been quite a few Catholic leaders of the Liberal Party. So the floodgates were opened.
In fact, there's been more Catholics leading the non-Labor parties than there have been leading the Labor Party in the 21st century. And what's interesting about that is that it becomes a gradual change too. I think you start to look at the turning points around about 1975. In 1975, at that double dissolution election after the dismissal of the Whitlam government, you get more Catholics on the coalition side of the House of Representatives than on the Labor side for the first time. Now, granted, there were very few Labor MHRs anyway, because they were thoroughly trounced at that election.
Yes.
But it's just sort of a symbolic turning point that gradually starts to get bigger. You get more and more Catholics putting their hands up for pre-selection for the Liberal Party. You get the breakdown of anti-Catholicism in the Liberal Party. I mean, it's just like in the community as a whole, sectarianism starts to disappear as a relevant issue. So more and more Catholics get into the Liberal Party.
And presumably having prominent Catholics in ministerial positions, people like Philip Lynch, would have been important to reinforce that this is a party, the Liberal Party is a party that takes Catholics seriously, that respects them, that includes them, that it's, sectarianism is dead and buried in the Liberal Party.
Yeah. I mean, Philip Lynch is a very interesting case, and I deal with him quite at length in the book. I'm not sure if he represents sort of a turning point. I think he is perhaps one of the last of the exceptions, and I've got a chapter in the book on the exceptions who prove the rule, and there are very few of them over the period that we're looking at. And Philip Lynch sort of comes in at the end of that. But it is true. I mean, he becomes the deputy leader of the Liberal Party in 1972. So that's quite amazing that would happen. But I think that is more as part of the exception than as later, when you start to get more and more Catholics being elected to Parliament on behalf of the Liberal Party or get to leadership positions. I still see him more as an exception than as part of a new trend. I think it's a little bit later that the trend comes. And you get to the stage in 2009, for instance, you get Malcolm Turnbull being challenged by Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey. So the battle for leadership of the Liberal Party is amongst these three guys.
Entirely Catholic. Yeah. So, although, Malcolm Turnbull was a Catholic convert, so...
Oh, yes, but he's certainly...
not born a Catholic, but three Catholics vying for the position. Jeff, a fascinating analysis of how the Iron Law that became no more. Thank you so much for joining me once again on Afternoon Light.
No, my pleasure, Georgina.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.